in a van to the jungle, as it was known, in Calais. And this was sort of a response to what was being called at the time the European refugee crisis, whereas I'm sure you're probably all aware there was a sudden increase in the number of people fleeing conflict and crossing the Mediterranean and traveling through Europe in search of safety. And there was lots of media coverage at the time, and lots of groups sprung up all over the UK and Europe trying to fill that gap where they saw governments not acting or not acting quick enough. And just everyday people and volunteers stepped in to try and help. And OHOB was part of that, and that's where we started. And then in 2016, we sort of developed into shipping larger aid in lorry containers to Greece. And to date, that's been 9 containers of lorries worth of aid. And the next one that we're planning for next month will be our 10th container. So in those sort of 5 years from that initial start in 2015, a lot has changed. There's less awareness, it's not on the news anymore, it's and if it is, it's sort of in a negative format. There's less media coverage, the jungle, as we know, was demolished, but yet there is that need still. So OHOB has remained, and we continue to support where we can, but we've changed too. As a charity, we're still providing support, but going through this journey of a continuous learning process of how we can do this in a way that is sustainable, efficient, and maintains the dignity for everyone involved, and where possible has the least impact on our environment. So it's a continuous learning process, and we're learning every day, but because there is that need still, we are still here and we're still working. And in 2019, we received our charity status and grounded ourselves within 3 aims that we now base all of our projects and all of our work around. So the first of our aims is this one on the screen in front of you. I just need to move my video because I'm blocking the words. So the first aim, to relieve and assist refugees, asylum seekers and displaced people throughout Europe through the provision of funds, food, shelter, access to water and sanitation and other humanitarian assistance. So I guess this was the core of what we were built on originally. And in doing this, we support 2 areas in Europe and 2 sort of key partner charities that we work with. And the first is mobile refugee support in northern France, in Calais and Dunkirk. And we started working with them, I believe, in 2017, when they kind of grew when the jungle was demolished, and they set up trying to kind of still provide something for the refugees that were still there in northern France. And for them, we ship sort of 3 to 4 vans worth of aid and provide funding for their Wi-Fi service. So I guess the core reason we sort of joined with Mobile Refugee Support is that they offer something that not a lot of other aid organisations that work in Europe do, which is this kind of technological side of support. So mobile Wi-Fi, a charging service, so refugees can charge their phones, because access to communication and information is vital, and that isn't always provided. So we help fund that sort of niche, and where we saw that there was a gap. And I mentioned earlier that the need is still there. So to give you a context, for France, our partners at MRS approximate that there's about 1,500 people in Calais and Dunkirk, sort of living not in a formal camp, as it were, just sort of amongst the wooded areas in the surroundings of the town. And in the first week of October, they had about 200 new arrivals to support. And that's sort of not living in a formal camp, where there's sort of regular police evictions to try and move people on that we know are not a solution at all, and they're not sustainable. People are sort of forcibly evicted and just moved to a new area, and then there's no provision from that, and people just then come back because there's nowhere else for them to go. So it's in a context of having to face constant police brutality, and aid is being confiscated, and the volunteers that work there are sort of faced with being accused of trafficking or supporting trafficking. So it's a difficult context for them to work in. It's particularly this year. Normally they would provide depend on things like festival salvage, so tents, camping equipment that people would leave behind at festivals is normally then collected by organisations like Refugees and taken to places like France. But obviously this year, COVID, everything's cancelled, so no festival salvage has meant that there is a gap there that organisations are trying to fill and fundraise for. And the second place where we ship our container aid to is Lesvos in Greece, so one of the Greek islands. And we partner with a charity called Attica Human Support. They run the largest aid distribution warehouse across the islands. So they're based on Lesvos, but their aid warehouse supports all of the Greek islands and also the mainland as well. So they're sort of a hub that work with a group of NGOs to support a population of approximately 21,000 at the moment. That changes sort of every day, but that was the latest report from the Aegean Boat Report that sort of gives up-to-date data for the number of arrivals and people leaving the islands. So for us at OHOB, we send 2 lorry containers per year to them of humanitarian aid, and the next one should be leaving in the second week of November, hopefully, if all things go to plan. And I'm sure, as many of you are aware, last month the main camp on Lesvos, Moria, burnt down, and sort of a new camp has been built in that place with a larger capacity. Moria had a capacity of 2,000 and this has a capacity of 7,500, but clearly not enough for sort of the 20,000 people that are actually there. And as most NGOs who actually work on the ground there have said, it's wholly unsuitable again. And you can see from this picture that it floods quite easily, and it's on an area that used to be military ground. So there's sort of dangerous objects still around on the floor. And I found a link actually last night that I've sort of included on this slide. So hopefully if the slides get sent out, you'd be able to access that. And it's a half-hour film done by BBC Newsnight in collaboration with an organisation called Refocus Media Labs. And they work with young refugee filmmakers who live on Lesvos to try and share their experiences. And this is sort of a half-hour film looking at that fire and the circumstances and the events around it and sort of life in this new camp. So I would definitely, if you have a chance, go and watch that. It's only half an hour and yeah, it's incredibly powerful. So yeah, definitely watch that. So yeah, so we ship aid to those 2 key organisations in Greece and France. And in everything that we do when we are collecting and shipping, we try and do this in partnership because it's the most efficient way to support people. And that's sort of key to what we do. So we build a network, we share experiences, skills, knowledge, so that otherwise we're not reinventing the wheel, we're not duplicating something that other people are already doing, and we're not wasting time and resources. So our supporters and groups across the Southwest, so all over Devon and Cornwall, and we've recently sort of become the Southwest hub for the Help Refugees aid appeals that they've been starting to do. So the tent aid appeal that was in September and the hygiene aid appeal that Help Refugees run, we're sort of the Southwest hub for that. So all donations that are collected in the Southwest will come to our storage facility. And it just means that the system works better. We can kind of share that responsibility and share the funding and resources for that. So we have drop-off points all over Devon and Cornwall, and these are supported by key locations by our Armadillo and Q-Store storage facilities. And they're packed. Once collected in these locations, we transport everything to Saltash, where we have a warehouse space that is very kindly donated to us by Q-Store. And that's where our team of volunteers pack and sort donations in boxes that are again donated very kindly by DS Smith. And everything that we collect aid-wise is directly informed by our partners on the ground. So we don't assume what people might need or what's being asked for. We ask our partners what the priorities are, what is needed, and they in turn are informed by the people that they support and the people that they distribute to. So we don't give priority to perhaps the easiest things to collect. We give priority to what is actually needed, and more often than not, perishable items, because, well, they run out. Once they're gone, they're gone. So food and toiletries, hygiene products, shelter, tents, blankets, camping equipment, and then warm clothing in the winter as well. And then sort of another, I guess, core aspect of what we try and keep to is sustainability. And we know that aid is a short-term response for a long-term problem, and it's not sustainable and can be incredibly wasteful. Particularly when I mentioned in northern France, you've got police destroying people's belongings or confiscating them, but then that need remains. So you still have to then, if someone's tent's destroyed, it doesn't mean they don't need that tent anymore. So you still give them another tent, but obviously that's a waste for the one that was destroyed needlessly. And the nature of the camps just mean that disposable products are what has to be needed. There's no washing facilities or sanitation. So we do know that aid creates waste. But it's still needed. So we can't not give what is needed. So where possible, we do endeavour to be sustainable in other ways. We have a clear needs list that we send out when we start collecting and send out our appeals, but often we get donations that aren't perhaps culturally appropriate or not particularly good quality, so we can't send everything that is donated. And in those cases where things are not good quality or dirty, perhaps we rag things, so we're not just throwing away clothing or textiles. It gets ragged and recycled by a company that work with St Luke's Hospice in Plymouth, so it's a local hospice to us. And actually they take those clothes that are only suitable for recycling, they recycle it and they get funding from that. So there's still no waste generated there. Where things are still good quality, but perhaps not suitable for a refugee camp, you'd be surprised how many stilettos we get donated, or sort of pairs of shorts that are too short. So where it's still good quality, we run jumble sales or donate to charity shops. If it's going to perhaps raise a bit more money than just a jumble sale, we will post it on eBay, and everything then that money generates goes back into either OHOB or help funding one of our partner organisations that work with refugees. And again, with the food, we collect food donations, but sometimes perhaps the date means that it won't last long enough to be sent out, or it perhaps is not suitable for sending, and in that case we donate to our local food banks. So all in all, everything that we try and do it in partnership and sustainability, and that sort of things that we've learned along the way. We've seen how perhaps waste has been generated, particularly in 2015 when everyone, I guess, sprung up and perhaps things were done in a way that was quick but not efficient. So it's a continuous process and we're learning as we grow. So that's sort of, I guess, our first project that we do, and our main project, our European Refugee Aid. And to sort of summarize, I wanted to show you this video that was made for us in 2018. And it kind of summarizes the first 3 years of OHOB and shows our founder Faraday explaining how and why she created it. Since 2018, we have sort of streamlined our processes more, so this doesn't perhaps show exactly what our warehouse or container loads look like in 2020, but it gives you a sort of brief insight into the process. It's sort of a 9-minute video, so I will show you that now. Is that still coming up on your screen?
So we can see the PowerPoint at the moment. If you go back to Zoom and share screen, you should be able to select a different screen.
Okay, let me do this. Never shared a screen before. So, new share. Is that the right one now?
Yeah, that's good.
Right, great. In
2015.
Sorry, Hannah, we can't hear it. I think maybe you might need to have your audio on.
In 2015, a Facebook group was created called Open Hearts, Open Borders Refugee. This was in response to the developing refugee crisis in Europe. Now, 3 years later, they have grown into a big organization. And today I am standing here in Saltish, where they are shipping a 40-foot container to Lesbos in Greece. This all for the people who really need it. Sorry about
I was in a gym, in my local gym, and I was on the treadmill having a run, trying to run off some excess weight, and I saw Calais on the TV, and that's kind of how it started. I got off my treadmill, looked at it, and went, what is this? What's going on? And from there, I went, okay, this is something that I didn't know anything about. And I went home, slept overnight, got woken up, but it's still in my head, opened up my Facebook the next morning, and there it was. There was the little boy on the beach. So that's how it all started. And it started off with some collections around Plymouth to send stuff over to France, over to Calais in France. And we van load of stuff that went over to France. November the 30th, we delivered it down to Cornwall, then to be shipped to France. And that's how it all begun. And then we started containers. So it's 2015, October 2015, in October 2015.
What do you think made it so successful, that it grew in such a short time?
Because the premise that I built it upon, I built it on the premise of love and kindness. And for me, that was very important. At its very core is love, kindness, generosity, giving, and completely without judgment. And I think that is why it's grown in the way it has. It's organically grown. It's grown very much as well as I've grown in the last few years, from going through my own personal stuff. And I feel that it's it does what it needs to do, and it attracts people who are very who support this cause, who support the refugee crisis, and in helping with the refugee crisis and looking for solutions. It attracts people very long term who want to do it long term. So we have a lot of long term volunteers. We have a lot of long term donators, you know, and we just continue with it. You know, even when it's got tough, we just keep going, we keep going, keep going, and I think that has helped it to grow, like really organically grow.
A lot of the tents and sleeping bags that we've got here have been rescued from what would potentially have been landfill. So we've got them from places like corporate events, festivals like Glastonbury, where all the tents are just trashed at the end of the day. We've got contacts now where we're able to go in and rescue these tents, so they then have a purpose in life rather than just being dumped into landfill.
So those can be stacked a lot better. If they're taking up room, they can be stacked a lot better. They can be stacked up on top of it. So it's like.
What is your role?
My role is, I suppose we're registered at the moment as a not-for-profit organisation, so I have the role of the director, so and the coordinator, so I run it. I deal with a lot of the coordination, finance, the fundraising, collections, organising collections of aid, so just making sure that they get collected and picked up, putting in new appeals, getting all the posters sorted out. I just do a lot of the stuff, I suppose, that it's the mechanics of it all to keep it working. And we've just very recently put in our charity registration, so now I'll be the chair of the charity. And I suppose my role is to keep it going, is to make sure that it keeps going and it keeps doing what it needs to do, and just attracting new people to it.
I believe it. Yeah.
I see a really huge, great big warehouse space, which is always stocked with aid, which is basically being shipped on a continual basis. That's where I want it to be in 5 years, and I want it to belong to the community. This is something that I built not for me, I built it for the community, and I built it for the people of the Southwest, because they predominantly were so supportive of this particular cause that I wanted to give them a central point of where we could donate, people could donate, we could ship, we could donate, we could all come together. And I think I've achieved that. So this belongs to the community, it is the community's. And what I want to see is, I want to see growth in terms of more aid, people giving us newer aid, maybe seconds, stuff like that coming in. I want the facility for other organisations and charities to come to us if they require things, so homeless charities or any other aid charities. And that's kind of where I want it to go. That's where I would like it to build.
It's difficult, do you know what I mean? When you go over there and you're dealing with children sleeping in the woods, sleeping in tents, and I'm talking babies of 7, 8, 9 months old, it's difficult. Do you know what I mean? Last winter we had a lot of deaths because there was a lot of desperate people trying to get to somewhere safe. So we had quite a few youngsters knocked over on the motorway. This year, as you've seen in the press already, we've got people trying to cross the English Channel. So it's a really difficult situation over there, you know, across the whole of Europe, actually, because of Brexit and everything else. No one's talking about the refugee crisis, but it hasn't gone away. It's just not been making the headlines in the newspapers and on the press. Do you remember, I got involved bizarrely because I've been signing petitions and sharing stuff on Facebook. And do you remember when that little boy got washed up on the beach, Alan Kurdi, in 2015? That for me was a huge moment, because I couldn't be bothered to sign petitions or share stuff on Facebook. I needed to be actively involved. So I opened my house up as a donation drop-off point for people to drop aid off to. And from then in 2015, it's basically escalated from there. So now I'm part of this organisation. I'm part of Mobile Refugee Support in France, and I go over to France every 3 months now. In France, we basically, we go out, we provide phone charging, we give food packs to families, we take orders for tents, sleeping bags, and we generally sit around the camp with them and just talk to people and be friendly and hear some of their stories and everything else, which is quite tragic, really. Because in Dunkirk, we're dealing with a lot of Kurdish people, and the Kurds in Iraq and Turkey and all that have been really persecuted. So you hear some horror stories over there, you really do, of what's being done to people by their own government. People who are meant to protect them are actually the people victimising them. So who do they turn to?
How demoralising is that?
Sustaining it when the press and the media is very negative. And so keeping going against the tide of resistance and negativity that can go on in the press. For me, it's been a struggle personally at times where I've had to, I suppose I've had to get over my own stuff, and I've been working, so it's time. But it's been, yeah, pushing against the tide. There was one point when we weren't getting as much aid, and that was quite tough. So for the last container that we did 6 months ago, we didn't have as much aid, so we found that a lot tougher. So I decided to change things around a bit and thought, no, we're not going to just run appeals, we're going to just keep aid coming in on a continual basis. And it worked, because this last container is just crammed and we've still got stuff left. So so that kind of worked. But I think it's the resistance, and it's sustaining the premise of it being built on love and kindness. You know, if you want to see generosity in this world, be generous. If you want to see solutions of the refugee crisis, become involved in it. Don't be complacent and just sit by and not watch, and just watch. Become involved, look for solutions, because this isn't going away, and this is our world, and we're all human beings, and we're all cut from the same cloth, and we don't work together enough, I don't feel. And I think there's a time now, I think, is to come together with all of this.
Right, if I go back to that. Okay, so that was 2 years ago. So some of the things that Faraday talked about have now happened. We are a charity, but I sort of thought it gave a little bit of an insight to what a container load looks like for anyone who might like to come along and volunteer. So Faraday in the video actually mentioned that she would like it to grow and support the local community as well. And that's what it's done. So our second aim covers that project. So the prevention of relief of poverty or financial hardship by providing persons in need with grants or monies, or providing or paying for services, items or facilities. And this aim is in connection with our local support that we provide mainly in Plymouth, but sort of surrounding areas as well, within our local communities. And it's sort of resettlement and social support. And it was prompted initially by a reduction in the government provision for refugees that are resettled here in the UK and asylum seekers. But it does offer support to anyone locally who is facing particular financial or social hardship. And when COVID hit, that included anyone who was affected by COVID, and we set up a particular relief appeal for that as well. And so we work with, again, working in partnership with people, we work with START, so students and refugees together in Plymouth, and the families that they support, we work with them. And the Eritrean community in Plymouth, we're quite involved with, and supporting them where they need, and so resettle refugees and asylum seekers. So as you're probably aware, state-funded provision for asylum seekers is quite limited. Even if you receive your resettled refugee status, again, the support that you receive from the government is incredibly limited. You might have accommodation, but quite often that's unfurnished, so you have no furniture, no personal belongings. Asylum seekers have about £5 a day to live off, and that doesn't necessarily change if your life event changes. So often we support young mums who are asylum seekers who are expecting a baby and they're not entitled to any kind of extra support for that. So what we do is we collect donations of household items, beds, any kind of furniture, fridges, freezers. Just last week we've funded a freezer for someone. Someone donated sort of all the furniture from their flat that they didn't need anymore, and that went to a Sudanese asylum seeker in Plymouth. But where possible, we do funding drives to pay for gift cards, so actually that people can choose for themselves what items they need and can have that choice and agency. And we work with other organisations. So the Exeter Good Prison Project is a project up in Exeter where reformed offenders quite often don't have clothes to leave the prison in once their sentence is finished. So this project makes sure that they have some clothing to support them when they leave. So that's something we help them with and we provide, and is kind of how we're branching out to support the wider community as well. And then, so that's our Resettled project. And then the third of our aims is this one. So the promotion of equality and diversity for the public benefit by advancing education and raising awareness in equality and diversity to foster the understanding of what it is like to be a refugee. And this came out of us thinking about how we wanted to grow and how we wanted to develop, and recognizing that our first two aims, so our work in Europe and our work locally, are an immediate response to an urgent need. But these needs will not ever go away unless there is long-term sustained change in societies, and our understanding and our response to displacement and how we respond to people who have been forcibly displaced. So in view of this, we thought we wanted to try and be part of that sustained change. It's obviously not going to happen overnight, but we truly believe that sort of small steps and working together, then something positive can come of that. So in view of this, we committed to this third aim. And that was in 2019, and we became involved with a project called Raffy and Friends. So this was set up in 2015, separate to us, Raffy and Friends, the project, and then we joined in 2019 and became the distributor for it and the main funder. And it's an education project aimed at primary school children, and is a series of books that uses stories of Raffy the rabbit and his friends to try and educate and encourage children to think about topics that might not necessarily come up on their regular curriculum. So topics such as displacement or people's differences, and recognizing what can make each of us special and unique, but also what unites us. So these books are accompanied by an arts-based workshop that is run by volunteers in the schools. And they have been run in schools in the UK, in Germany, in Canada, in festivals in the UK, sort of mainly local ones for us in Devon and Cornwall, and in refugee camps in Jordan and Lesbos. So the first book in the series is about Raffy the refugee rabbit, and tells a story of Raffy, of how he has to leave his home in the woods because there's a fire, and he journeys to find a new home and new friends. And we use this story to try and talk to children about that journey and how it can be similar to the one that children all over the world often have to make themselves. So we use this metaphor as Raffy the rabbit to bring up that subject and to try and introduce that idea to children who might not otherwise have an awareness of that. It was inspired by the lady that you can see on the left over here, Hamza, and she had to leave Syria and journeyed to Germany, and the lady who wrote the books, Pauline, met her through a friend who happened to live in Germany, near where Hamza was resettled, and basically the idea began from there that she wanted to then create this book inspired by Hamza's story. So the book is distributed along with the workshop. We encourage children to think about this journey, and then part of the workshop involves thinking about the children's hopes and dreams for the future, and they're encouraged to draw those dreams. And we then share drawings of children from across the world of what they hope and dream for the future as well. And then the idea is that we sort of show the children how similar their hopes and dreams are to each other, despite coming from different backgrounds, having completely different lived experiences, and encourage them to think about how similar their hopes and dreams are, and try and, we hope, to encourage some sort of understanding and compassion in the younger generation around these topics. So this sort of, we joined in 2019, and the aim was to try and build the project and relaunch it this year, but obviously with COVID, that's sort of taken a step back because we can't physically go into schools at the moment. We were due to do some workshops in June to kind of trial the new format that we've set up, but that's sort of all been postponed. So at the moment, it's we've been using this quiet time to try and find a constant source of funding for this project, because we fund the books, so the children each have a book to take home with them to try and also replicate those discussions back in the home. So at the moment we're using this time to try and find the funding for that, but our hope is that we can start to distribute and start to do these workshops again. And we just hope that perhaps through sharing these stories, we can be part of fostering that culture of love and understanding to try and create some form of change for the people who are displaced. So all of these sort of three aims cover our three main project areas, and in all that we do, we are volunteer led. So all of these projects are run and maintained by volunteers. And none of that would be possible without the local people in Devon and Cornwall sort of coming together and donating their time towards that. And in view of that, I want to hand over to Emily, who's one of our trustees and lead volunteers, to sort of share her experiences of volunteering in this sector. Emily, I'll hand over to you.
Well, thank you, Hannah. Hi, everyone. I was just reading up about your conference. It looks absolutely amazing. I wish I'd been at university when this was all running. Yeah, Hannah asked if I could just talk a little bit about how I got into volunteering with refugees, and the final link with Open Hearts, Open Borders, really. So just going back a bit, I guess my first interest in humanitarian aid came around in the 90s, probably. There was a program called Challenge Annika, hence why she's on the screen, where she did some amazing projects, and one of them was in Romania with the orphanage, which may hit the headlines massively across the news. Some people probably remember it. Drawing people's attention to the appalling conditions in the orphanages in Romania at the time, and looking at how people could collect aid and get it sent out around the country to Romania. So that was my first introduction to kind of getting interested in humanitarian aid. So when I went to university in Plymouth a while ago, there was a charity, a volunteer group at the time called Student Community Action in Plymouth, which is now the main student volunteering. At the time it wasn't funded though, so it was a person doing it on top of their own job that kind of coordinated us. And there was only a small group of us, but we did fundraising during our university years, and in our third year we took a load of aid over to Romania in partnership with a Romanian charity, and we refurbished a bungalow for disabled children that would be leaving an orphanage, and who were trying to get them out of the orphanage so they could live independently with nurse support when they were 18. And I know colleagues went back a few years later to find that it was all up and running and people were using it and living independently from the orphanage, which was amazing news. So when I eventually managed to get a career-related job to my degree at uni, I actually came back to Plymouth for the job. I worked for an environmental charity, particularly with 16 to 24-year-olds, and helping young people get involved in volunteering, particularly around the environment and community area. And whilst I was here, I decided to do a very belated Gold Duke of Edinburgh Award. I was a bit older then, and as part of the one, you had to look for a residential project. So someone recommended me an organisation called Oak Hall, which is the picture on the screen there. They're actually a Christian organisation based near London, but they do a few aid missions, aid projects, and this one was a big one in the Balkans. It was set up during early 90s, I think, after the war in Yugoslavia. And so I went out with one of they did 4 trips a year, taking out that big bus with a massive trailer on the back with aid that was collected around the country. And 4 times a year they would go to Petrovac in North Serbia, which is where a guy from Oak Hall had been setting up a Bible school there with people from all over the different areas of the Balkans, so that they could be ministers or youth workers to go then back to their countries. And so we would go and join them for a week. This was in around Easter time, the time I went, and every day we'd go out to some of the refugee camps around there. So they were more camps that I would say were hotels, old hotels that no one lived in, so a family would be in every room, and there wasn't any state funding at all for refugees over there. And so this was the only aid that they got 4 times a year. So when I came back to Plymouth, I thought, you know, this is really interesting, obviously, and to see if I could do something in Plymouth, you know, working with asylum seekers and refugees. My housemate at the time was Kurdish as well. I recently arrived and just had a positive decision. So I looked and found a charity called START, which I believe Avril did a workshop the other day for you, so you probably are aware of START, but Students and Refugees Together. And I went to the first project day. It was the first one was the Cultural Kitchen. It's before they even had a paid member of staff. It was being run by a 3rd year social work student for 10 weeks. And it was a food project originally set up because some of the her clients that she'd been working with had attempted to commit suicide because they weren't able to eat. And so this student and another student decided to get a small grant together to do a food project, looking at healthy eating and in Sherwood Church Hall. And so that ran for 10 weeks and was really popular, not just with young people, but with all ages, asylum seekers and refugees. And so then that continued, and it has continued to this day. So that's over 18 years now it's been running, along with START itself, that's obviously got paid staff and is a lot larger charity now. But that was my first volunteering in Plymouth, and it was just something completely different. It was amazing to see so many people from different countries. Bear in mind, Plymouth 20 years ago was even more white, bar some guys at the university, and it was only just had recently become a displacement area. So there was a few young people from Kosovo, and a couple of guys from Africa, a few from the Middle East. But you know, when we started at the Cultural Kitchen, but it's obviously over this last 18 years or so, it's really changed in Plymouth, which is really good. So this was a very new project at the time, but considering it's in a quite small church hall, was an amazing area for people to come together, and all different people from around Plymouth, as well as asylum seekers, refugees, came together and kind of created quite unique projects as a result of that. So that was something really inspiring to be part of, and through my job working with young people, I managed to forward quite a lot of young volunteers from Plymouth in to volunteer at the Cultural Kitchen, on from the other way, and also a lot of the youngsters I worked with as a volunteer at Cultural Kitchen came away with us on our environmental volunteering days and residentials, etc. So it kind of had 2 hats on really for that. But as a result of that, I stayed with START all the way through, but I then became a student with them on placements when I did my master's in youth and community work. My dissertation was on how environmental volunteering could reduce social exclusion amongst young asylum seekers and refugees, and through that we did a lot of interviews with interpreters, and it was amazing. Really, the feedback really was the youngsters that came on the practical days, a lot of them didn't speak any English because they had literally just arrived, but obviously trying to volunteer and on the list for waiting to go to, you know, to do English lessons, there was a massive waiting list. So it was one of the only things they could do because it was so practical and you didn't really need to rely on spoken English. They were able to engage straight away, and some of the main feedback has been that when they'd arrived, at least when they were walking around town, they might recognise some of the young people they'd been volunteering with, and kind of made them feel a bit like part of a family and maybe a bit more welcoming. So so that was really important to kind of get that feedback, and I think if we hadn't done it as a project we probably wouldn't have known that. So that was really really good. So and the answer to the project was yes, it did reduce social exclusion to some extent, but it was a good starting point for us as an organisation to look at how we could encourage more asylum seeker refugees to volunteer and also share that learning with other charities around the city years later. So that was a really good learning point. I then was asked if I could become a trustee a few years ago for START. At the time it was to bring the age range down from the trustees because they wanted some younger people to be involved. Now there is a few more younger people, definitely younger than me anyway. So, but no, it's been interesting to see it as a trustee's perspective as well, you know, for an organisation and how that runs. Definitely learning a lot still on that one. Yeah, Anna, thanks. And then on top of that, so whilst I've been around volunteering in Plymouth, I was then wanting to look at how, you know, the wider journey for some of the guys obviously end up in Plymouth. They obviously their journey is massive, and to kind of get a feel for how it is from another perspective. So I found out about a charity called Humanitarian Support Agency through another volunteer at START. And in 2018, I went over to Lesbos in Greece, the one you're hearing about a lot on the news at the moment. And I volunteered in Calais, which is a really unique refugee camp. It's nothing like Moria. It's basically about 1,000 people, probably a bit more at the moment, and it will be the more vulnerable groups that get forwarded there. And it's actually funded by the town, well, as opposed to the other camp. They all are living in ISO boxes, a step up from the UN tents. So they do get food deliveries. And I was volunteering here where all the aid, some of which would have come possibly from OHOB years before, gets arrived on Lesbos to Attica, who Hannah mentioned, and then it gets distributed to all the different charities on the island, of which one of them was Humanitarian Support Agency. So we would sort the aid and we would run this charity shop you can see in the picture. So anyone that arrives in this camp would get a booking slot to come in and get an allocation of clothing. Providing them with dignity, they get like an hour per housing unit to come in and get a set of clothing. So that would be either in the summer or the winter. So each season every 3 months. But most people will have left within a year. I think one of the biggest learning points is if they leave doesn't mean they've necessarily gone on to a positive decision. It means they might be moving off the island back to Athens to go onto another camp. But some people were given decisions whilst we were there, and some of which were living and starting to live in Lesbos itself. So that was a really unique opportunity to be within the community there. We were one of the only charities in the camp, along with a couple of others, and none of them were big national charities. These were more local ones. But it did give a unique experience of working with the families or couples that came through each hour on the hour to help them get at least some basic clothing. And the middle bit there actually is just showing that they had an amazing sense of community though. There was an evening once a week where people could get together and they could play music and kind of have that family feeling. One of the sad things though was if you did get a positive decision and you stayed on the island, you weren't allowed to come back to the camp. So you wouldn't be allowed to be a visitor or anything. So it was positive on one side that you had, able to start getting state support. On the other hand, obviously where that family you might have developed, it was quite sad for them that they couldn't come back and do that. But they'd obviously meet them in town otherwise. There's a bit at the bottom there with urns that you see there, and there's a bit of a link to a story that comes with that a bit later on. The next slide. After that, I was looking, when I came back, looking for some volunteering opportunities back in Plymouth, as well as Cultural Kitchen, particularly around the aid element, and I'd heard a lot about OHOB. So I got in touch and was invited to come to some of the sorts. The picture at the bottom was when it was getting quite crazy with the amount of aid we had to work through back in January this year, actually, just have a volunteer there just to see how big it was. Every few weeks coming in to start working our way through the bags. But eventually it looks like that beautiful boxes later on, just before it goes into a container. The unique story at the top of the screen is the tea urns. So when I came to volunteer last year, I was finding out a bit more about the project. I was lucky to meet Hannah, but also Faraday. And she was saying that we were just about to set up as a charity formally. And I was telling her about these, this project that I've been doing over in Lesbos. And then we found out that actually the tea urns that we were using over in Lesbos were the ones that had been funded by Saltash, OHOB, and had been sent out the previous year. So it turned out there was a real cycle there, which was amazing, really, to think that everything had been fundraised in Plymouth and the wider area. That money then, as they'd contacted HSA and they'd said, we're desperate for urns, we need to get water so that the residents could get, you know, flasks of hot water every day, you know, that they can run it themselves. And then Faraday said literally what she'd done is she'd gone out and bought them, sent thousands of tea bags over, and then they'd hooked it all up. And the time that I was there, they must have been there about a year by then, and they were still running. So obviously when I was there, I didn't realise that they'd come from Plymouth until obviously finding out last year in the warehouse. So that was quite an amazing circle of events, really. Last year also, with obviously heard about the mobile MRS project that Hannah talked about earlier, and thought it'd be really good also to see what was going on in Calais, to see how some of the guys that we were working with in Plymouth, this was obviously one of their routes in. So I managed to get in touch with Help Refugees and go and volunteer with them for a week. So they've got a massive warehouse over there. There's several charities, but this one was quite unique in the sense it's got lots of different organisations working together to have this massive warehouse where volunteers are literally involved. As you can see, it is huge in terms of areas of sorting everything. And then from that, they then take sections of aid every night to the parks, or setups in the afternoon at the different parks where people are staying to distribute aid to everybody. And then there's also a kitchen. So those ladles are the size of much longer than my arm. They are absolutely ginormous. And those containers at the bottom, those are like full of tea. So the system is that you'd have to do that all day, and they would just be distributed to different areas of Calais and Dunkirk every day on a routine structure, a bit like a very large soup run. But I think the most incredible thing at this project here was that everything was run by volunteers. There was no paid staff coordinating anything. And the fact that all this information and all these techniques of doing things had been developed over time, and anything that worked really well was kept and shown to the next person and shown to the next person. And just the scale of the operation was just incredible, really. When I was there, Calais had just started to provide food to refugees, which hadn't happened up until then. So the refugee kitchen would be going out in the early evening with a hot meal every day, which was made in the kitchen there as well at the Help Refugees warehouse. And around that week, they'd started to, they'd noticed that the town had started to provide food, which was very unusual because up until that point they hadn't been, but apparently it was all due to the elections. So yeah, I don't know if that still continued now, but it was really distressing to see the amount of security that hang around all the time. Even if we were delivering food, there was always some security around to just keep an eye, and also puts everybody at unease as well. And to hear that, you know, you might have delivered aid a few days before, like Hannah said, and then find that it's all been cut and taken a few days later in an early morning raid, and then people are having to restart their life again, you know, literally 2 days later. So yeah, so really heartbreaking, but you can see how essential the aid was straight away, you know, that it was getting used as much as possible. And the amount of volunteers that were there was incredible, people from like all over the country. Interestingly enough, there wasn't many from France at the time. The person we stayed with was French, and she was a local volunteer, but she did say it's a really difficult one, really, because people in the area are very sympathetic to it, but they're also struggling with it themselves as residents. So it was interesting that actually the majority of volunteers at the time were from Britain and from other countries as well. But it was just an interesting point, you know, really. Next one. And kind of finally, I did go back to Lesbos this year, but decided to go with a different charity to find out a different perspective. And currently this charity is called Refugee for Refugees, but if you're looking to volunteer at Calais, here or anywhere now, Indigo Volunteers is the charity that is now overseeing all the volunteer applications. So they really look after a lot of the grassroots charities, look at what they need. They then promote on behalf of the charities, and then as a volunteer you can apply to them and they will help match you to the right one, so to help those organisations, you know, free up some of their time. So this time I was with Refugee for Refugees. This time it was supporting Moria, the camp that Hannah's shown you the link for already, primarily. The biggest change I found going back was in the Moria camp, which Hannah's mentioned. There would have been about 10,000 people when I was there 2 years ago, and now it's over 20,000, and that was in January. People are arriving every night. When I was there before, people were obviously over capacity, but they were in the area of the military zone, the old military zone. When I came back in January, the whole olive plantation on either side has been taken over with accommodation. Everywhere is taken. So the charities, the two charities, Refugee for Refugees and Movement on the Ground, are actually now renting part of the farm, the olive plantation, from the farmer on behalf of all the refugees that are turning up currently, and there is no space in the compound. So they're having to get a tent from I think it was Eurosport at the time, and then they literally place themselves either side of the camp, and whichever camp they go in, that charity is trying to provide toilets and some kind of rubbish removal service, you know, on either side to make it vaguely more humane. People still go into Moria to be processed, but then obviously the accommodation isn't there, and full stop, really. And so the stuff that we were doing, Refugees for Refugees, was partly collecting rubbish. So people will have bin bags, which they'll stack up, but there is no routine collection like there is in, you know, in the town. So we would, as long as it was stacked in bags and collected, the charity then paid for someone to come and collect the rubbish a couple of times a week. So that at least that would make it slightly more hygienic. The food was being provided though through centrally. And then the toilets were obviously starting to be, and drainage was starting to go in. As you can see, it was getting really flooded. Obviously this is all just before the fires. So yeah, that's even, it is horrific to see those fires after how much people were so cramped in anyway over there. And so we were helping with an unusual project in January. So apart from sorting all the aid that had arrived again to Attica, which is the charity that our donations go to, this picture at the bottom is our aid arriving on the beginning of January. So I went to see it arriving in the warehouse at Attica to show to people back home that it has actually arrived and this is where it goes. It then gets sorted again, and then the charities like Refugee for Refugees will come and collect some of it. We will then sort it again, and then this stuff was then going into a shop which anyone that moved into the area they looked after would get a voucher to come and on a certain day to come and get some clothes from the charity shop, which is all free. It just gave them the chance to have a more dignified shopping experience. Unfortunately, that is a one-off offer at the moment, and for men they weren't offered it at all because there is not enough men's clothes available. And the thing is, even if we had some clothes, we couldn't give them out because unless you have enough for everybody, we couldn't give it out to just a few. So it was prioritising the unaccompanied minors and the women and children. However, the bag picture at the bottom left, that was done through us sorting through everything outdoors, and at the last minute it was decided, because it was so cold in January, and they had regular power cuts at the camp, there was a lot of riots going on quite regularly. So the idea was to see if we could clothe everybody in the left-hand side of the camp within a couple of weeks. So I was only here for the first week of it. So what we were doing is they were marking up every tent, making a unique map of the area, and then sending through the orders for like male, female, etc. age. And then we were bagging up essentials in those bags there. So for every housing pod, they were given a set of clothes. And I think when I left, they had another week to go, and they'd managed to clothe over 2,000 people in a couple of weeks. And I think from there, it was interesting, they said that the other charities around there were going to use that technique and hopefully do that for their side. So that was something just happened to be there at the right time for something a bit new to be trialled. And that picture at the bottom is to show that the Plymouth boxes made it and they were being reused in the charity shop. So it was good to come full cycle.
Thanks, Emily, and thank you for sharing that experience of working on the ground, which, yeah, it was amazing to be able to see that the stuff we were sending was still arriving, and the boxes get reused, which is great. So that's sort of, I guess, an overview of how we've grown, how we've developed, and the work that we do as a charity, and giving you a bit of an idea perhaps of what it's like to be a volunteer. If you want to get involved, obviously we're local to the southwest. I don't know how local you all are, but there will definitely be refugee charities and support charities all over the UK, and I'm sure many of you are already involved. If you did want to join us, my email is on the slide, and the links to our social media and our website. And yeah, just get in touch. We have a whole range of volunteers that do different things across all of our projects, whether it's helping run a Raffy and Friends workshop, or packing a container, or fundraising. Yeah, there's a whole range. So do definitely get in touch if you want to get involved with what we do. And yeah, thank you for listening. I think there might be time for questions. I'm not sure, but if anyone has any questions, then yeah.
Hi Hannah, thanks so much for speaking. That was a wonderful talk. Thank you. We've got about 10 minutes left for questions, if that's okay.
Yeah.
We've got quite a few. So the first one, you said that giving aid is, like you do, is only a short-term solution. What do you see as a longer-term solution to the refugee crisis?
I guess governmental change and safer routes to asylum, and that's something that we do advocate for on our social media, and we do really try and push and reach out to our local MPs and be part of the petitioning and the protesting about that, is that actually safer routes are needed for asylum. I think last year I did a talk where at the time the statistic for the number of refugees that are resettled was 0.1%. So the number of refugees that are actually given status in an area near their original location, so Jordan or Iraq or Lebanon, the number that are actually resettled from there is 0.1% of all displaced people, which is obviously clearly not a solution. It's not quick enough. It's not helping people. So that needs to change, and that is the longer term solution. So we push for that, but at the same time, there is still this need. We can't ignore the people who are traveling through Europe, and we still need to provide that support as well. So for us, we're trying to balance pushing for longer term change, but also trying to provide these shorter term solutions that are needed as well.
I also would say, sorry, on that one is quicker decision making, because I mean, for instance, obviously just the people on the islands, they are seen as a forgotten community, you know, and the government in Greece is struggling economically anyway, you know, taking on a bit more support from other countries probably would help. The amount of people that arrive on the island and the amount that leave is like maybe a couple of hundred a week, if that. And you know, there's all these people that people forget are really skilled people that are just waiting and waiting and waiting, you know, and if they could be more actively involved as well, that would be, you know, with using some of their skills whilst they're waiting. But that's just a long waiting process is really bad mentally for people as well.
Okay, great, thank you. Somebody has commented, you're doing some incredible work and it's clearly very needed. Where do you get your financial funding from, and is this ongoing or is it more ad hoc?
So it's a whole mixture. We apply for funding bids. So every year we kind of look for funding. So this year we got funding from the National Lottery. We applied to their emergency COVID funding that they made available with the government, because otherwise we would have probably had to have stopped a lot of the work we do, because we run at a break even pretty much. We try not to obviously keep too much in the bank because we want to help people. So as soon as COVID hit, that meant that we needed to apply for funding. So yeah, we get funding from the National Lottery, charities. We're looking to try and get the Raffy project sort of crowd-funded or match funded. We do have a match funder who is a larger charity for that project at the moment. The aid we can't get funding for, so funding bids are they like to fund the running costs, so we can cover running costs and things like that through funding bids. But everything aid-wise is donated by people, basically in the UK.
Okay, lovely. How long on average are refugees remaining in the camps in Greece, such as the Lesbos camp? Do they stay on the camps until the applications are processed, or simply until they move on or are moved elsewhere?
Several years, if not more. Yeah. So some of the guys at Calais was a slightly different setup. They'd all be processed at Moria, but some of them would be sent to, say, the Calais camp, which was a more secure camp. But from there, in that camp, there wouldn't be anyone longer than a year, which means they would be moved. Some people were placed in Lesbos, but quite a few, majority would have been moved back to Greece. And from there, some of them would have gone to camps. That when they leave the island doesn't mean that they necessarily got a positive decision. It's the next stage of a process. And especially for the Calais camps, they will be going to a camp which is not as good condition as the one there. The ones in Moria, which is the majority, they can be there for many years. Yeah, some of them might move quite quickly, and some might be placed in Lesbos, but Lesbos, as you imagine, it's really like a big town. The majority of the population is at the bottom of the island, and there obviously is a lot of difficulties with the local population at the moment. You can understand it from their perspective now, they're struggling as well. So some people were based there, but the majority would be moved off. There's a few that will choose voluntary return, same in England, but obviously not the majority. So it is a big waiting game. And then if they do come to Athens, I think the majority again are waiting. So it's not a quick turnaround, even if they go off the island. Yeah, we always think it is a positive, but it's a positive in a way, but it's another step on the chain. Yeah.
Okay, thank you. How do you support yourself financially when you are volunteering abroad or volunteering in the long term?
So the one abroad I saved up for. Yeah, so basically, even with the first time round, I looked up the organisations to go with and had a friend recommend the HSA one, because it is a minefield actually with organisations. It's quite hard to work out who to go with, etc. as well, and to make sure the money, sometimes they ask for a donation as well, so you want to make sure it's going to the right place. Hence why the Indigo setup is much better. They don't take any money for it, but you can give them a donation if you wish, but they will help then make sure you're placed in a place that is needing people. So I think that's a really good setup in the last few years. But the rest of it, in terms of your flight, they can provide you accommodation. With some of the charities, they might already rent some houses, in Lesbos, for instance, which you then pay a rent for, but it can be cheaper because it's like a house of 8, say. So that could be cheaper than you personally having to rent a room or a flat somewhere. But really, you do need to pay for your time, obviously your travel and your food and your accommodation. So it's just a case of savings, really. They do say, though, in a few places I've met, that if you can go for longer than a month or a couple of months, that they will give you either a lot cheaper accommodation, or you might be able to, in certain places, take on a coordinator type role, which means you kind of get your accommodation free or maybe like a donation in the month, you know, towards your food. So if you can commit for longer, then that is can be an incentive for some places. Locally, I work as well, so obviously the OHAB for me is not very far away to drive to, and for Culture Kitchen I can walk to it, so those very local ones are more easy to run. Although having said that, I know a few people now are helping with charities that live further afield, or they might only be able to do virtual volunteering, so they might be able to sell, for example, some of the charity goods online on behalf of the charity, so that they don't physically have to do that travel, or if they're not able to travel themselves. And there's other ways like that now to get involved. Does that answer that question?
Yeah, it does, absolutely. And then we've got one more question. So this is so it's from somebody who they just explained before that they've set up a maternity project working with refugee women at a centre in Calais, and they said that they sometimes find it hard to get specific products. So the question is, how do you make sure you're collecting specific items that you want?
Oh, Hannah, you could do that one.
So we have a clear list that we encourage people to stick to, and the list is informed by what we're asked for by the organisation. So for France, because it's MRS, it will include things like phones, chargers, batteries, battery packs, because that's the nature of their like mobile Wi-Fi support that they offer. And we collect everything in, and everything is checked before it is sent. So we try only to send the things that have been asked for, and we are quite specific in what we ask for. And if it's not possible for people to donate things that are needed, so particularly for Attica and Lesvos, they quite often will want new underwear, brand new underwear, because everyone wants new underwear and you don't want secondhand underwear. And we will then fundraise for that to buy those products specifically because they are needed, and we will then go out and buy items that perhaps aren't as easy to collect from supporters.
The other one on the maternity stuff though, from that question, we tend to get quite a lot of donations from groups that knit and make amazing hats. You know, you can imagine various groups have been making them and they send in massive amounts of homemade brand new stuff. So I might suggest to the person who wrote that question, if they contacted maybe some of their local, maybe possible knitting groups, or put a little advert out to find out about who does those kind of projects, because I know, people are always quite keen to do an activity, particularly currently now going through potentially another lockdown, or those that are shielding might be quite keen to make things, which would be really useful then to be sent out for that maternity project. Because one thing at the moment they don't want at the moment as much of, when I was there in January, is that they didn't want any more baby stuff at the moment because they kind of filled capacity in their building for that. But obviously other areas like Calais, like you say, right now might be desperate for it. So specifically maybe contacting some of those kind of knitting groups and seeing if they'd be willing to make that a focus for some of their work for the next few months. That might work really well.
Okay, thank you. That's really great. That's all the questions. So thank you so much, Hannah and Emily. It's been a wonderful talk. Thank you very much.
Thank you for having us.
Yeah, thank you very much.